Senate Bill 1701 by Senator Green on third and final consideration.
Senator Green, you're recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to move Senate Bill 1701 on third and final consideration. And as I blundered into it earlier, this actually redefines what a POV is. Privately owned vehicle could be, in the way the law was written and passed, be held just to the person's vehicle that they own. So if you borrow your friend's vehicle and drive to work, then maybe you're not covered. Or if you're renting a car because your car is in the shop, you might not be covered. So this bill just clarifies the definition of a POV, and I move 1701 on final consideration.
Senator Green moves passage of Bill 1701 on third and final consideration. That's the second amendment, Mr. Clerk.
Amendment number 1, filed timely by Senator Beavers.
Senator Beavers or Wilson, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would make the motion on amendment number 1. And same argument, folks. This is not addressing the whole problem with the law that we passed last year. And, Mr. Speaker, I think that's all I have to say at this time.
Senator Beavers moves adoption amendment number 1. Is it seconded? Is there a second on amendment number 1? It's seconded. Senator Green, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This bill was not intended to fix all of the problems with that, and there's certainly recourse. Another member could file their own bill if they want to tackle the other issues of that law. This bill is intended to fix one specific problem and one specific problem only. So I would like to. Mr. Speaker, I am aware that there are other members of the body who would like to comment on the amendment. If I could, when they've had the opportunity to speak, if you could come back to me, I'd appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I had a question if the sponsor of the amendment would yield. I noticed that this amendment appears to be identical to the amendment that was previously offered, and my question is whether the sponsor of the amendment does not have a bill, in fact, a separate bill pending that this body may later consider that would do this as well.
Thank you, Senator Norris. And that's a good question. Last week we were told on this floor, if you have a bill you want to be heard before we get into the budget hearings, you should put it on notice. So I put my bill on notice that is this exact language, only to be told, oh, well, we're not going to hear those next week. We're going to lump all those bills together and hear them at a later date after all the budgets are heard. And I feel so strongly that there are some things that are wrong with the present law that is on the book. I don't know where we're going in committee with this, and so therefore I'm trying to put this on this bill today to correct everything.
Further discussion?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to be on the board on this vote.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And this question would be for Senator Beavers. The definition of personal property appears to be a little broad. Could that also include things such as alcohol, explosives, or drugs?
I would think it would have to be anything that you legally possessed.
So if you legally possessed explosives, then it would cover that, or the same with, if you had a case of liquor in your car, or if you had a legally bought over a period of time the legal amount of Sudafed, you could have that in your car. Is that correct?
You'd have Sudafed in your car, because sometimes I do.
Like, 300 or 400 tablets that you'd accumulated over a period of time.
Senator McNally, I think we're getting into another piece of legislation, but I don't believe that I'm able to buy that much pseudoephedrine at this time legally. Well, Senator McNally asked me if I bought it over a period of time. I don't buy that much over a period of time. I have trouble getting a 10-day supply at this point. So,
thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just a point of order. If, as stated by the sponsor of the amendment, gun bills, quote unquote, were to be referred to judiciary in a separate docket, a gun bill docket, then how is it that this gun bill is before us today? I could have asked the question earlier, but I was working on other matters. So we have a gun bill here. She has this gun bill that's represented in this amendment is a separate bill that is pending and is going to be heard. So if we could yield to the chairman of the judiciary for clarification, how is it that we can deal with this bill today but not Senator Beavers' bill?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There were 4 bills regarding firearms that were requested to be put on notice very early. They were introduced prior to or immediately adjacent to the beginning of session. They had passed second consideration in enough time to come on our calendar on, I believe, week 2 of our meeting. And all 4 of those bills were considered. Some were passed, some were not passed. Some were put over until later. Others, again, others passed and are before us. Subsequent to those 4 bills being put on notice, a deluge of firearm bills has been filed by this body. I mean, we have tons and tons of gun bills that have been filed by this body. And so out of an effort to try not to be in this very situation that we find ourselves in which we are having conflicting bills introduced and being pushed at the same time, I found it prudent to put all of those onto the same calendar once we've gotten through today's deadline to see exactly what all is out there. And that is the decision, that is the thought behind the decision that was made.
And Mr. Speaker, it seems to me it would not be inappropriate for the matter to be re-referred to judiciary. And I think that's part of the problem a number of members are having here. They may be supportive of some of the sentiments expressed in the proposed amendment, which is a standalone bill, and yet we have a limited bill here on which that amendment arguably does not fit. So I would move to re-refer to judiciary.
Mr. Speaker, I just wanted to understand the motion by the leader. He's making a motion that this amendment be referred back as a bill or the underlying bill? Good. Mr. Speaker, if I could, I would like to object to that motion and would request that we vote on 1701. 1701 went through committee. It was heard by the committee. The committee voted on that bill. This bill is ready to be heard by the Senate. What's happening is someone's trying to attach an amendment to it that does something completely different, addresses a completely other problem that could be handled in a separate bill, knowing even that today the filing deadline is still open until later today. I object to that motion and request that the leader withdraw that motion.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and with all due respect to my friend from Montgomery, I appreciate your level of interest in this, and I hope the members appreciate my level of interest in the decorum of the body. There is confusion here because these items were not heard on the same docket where members could consider them, compare them, and contrast them. I can't call the speaker out of order. It works the other way around. I'll tell you what I'll do. I have their rapt attention, so I thank you, Mr. Speaker. I will yield to Senator Canfield.
Was wondering if the sponsor of the amendment, the bill is already, I have to agree with Senator Green that the bill has already been through judiciary. It has been vetted by the Judiciary Committee. Well, it may be more appropriate, instead of sending it back to judiciary, to send it to calendar committee until all the other gun bills come forward, and then at that time we could it might be a more appropriate place for it to go. I was wondering if the sponsor of the motion would be willing to adjust where the bill is sent to.
Senator Norris?
I would be in theory. I don't know whether I'd have to defer to the clerk to see whether that's an appropriate motion. I know I can move to refer. I could move to refer it to calendar, but then, Mr. Clerk.
Well, you could always withdraw your motion, make a new one, or amend your motion. Would that take a vote? So,
Well, if I would
sponsor the motion. If you want to withdraw the other motion, you have every right to do that without objection, of course.
But I could also move to amend my motion.
Either one.
I'll amend to move it to calendar then.
The motion is now to re-refer this bill to the calendars. We're on a motion to re-refer. Senator Bowling, you're recognized on the motion to re-refer to calendar.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm trying to follow the course of all this, and it seemed that we just voted on Bill 1700. And now this 1701, as was acknowledged by the sponsor of this bill, is not perfect, but it was a tactical move in order to address a particular issue in the bigger problem that many of us perceive in the bigger bill. Are we now saying by moving this to calendar that we are going to be willing to sacrifice the better than what is in the current legislation for the perfect, which is what could be considered by judiciary in the aggregation of all of the other bills that address many of the bigger problems? It would seem prudent, since we just passed Bill 1700. I see no reason not to go ahead and move forward on this bill, simply because this would then allow this to become statutory, whereas if we wait, we might lose everything. We might sacrifice the good for the perfect.
Senator Overby?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We heard these two bills in Judiciary Committee, 1700, 1701. There was no request during proceedings of the Judiciary Committee to defer these bills to a later date. No one made that request. We heard them, we vetted them, we've thoroughly discussed them. In my mind, they are really companion bills, and having voted already on Senate Bill 1700, I would urge that we proceed to act on Senate Bill 1701.
Senator Norris?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll withdraw the motion.
No objection. Motion with.
Mr. Speaker, thank you. A big part of the concern I have here is just the precedent that we're setting in the Senate. I have a bill that's very specific, that's gone through committee, and on the floor we're rewriting the bill and bringing some other ideas in. And I hope that that's certainly not a precedent that's going to happen as we each bring our bills before our committees and present them, and then they get to the floor, and because they're not what everybody wants, we bring a big amendment on the floor. I worry about the precedent of that, Mr. Speaker. But again, I recognize from legal counsel that this amendment is outside the caption of my bill. And so because of that, Mr. Speaker, I move to table this amendment.
I would ask you to vote against the tabling motion. We don't know when we'll be able to hear the bill that I have had drafted that has been filed, that was put on notice for last week, and I would ask you, that may be a month away after the budget hearings, I would ask you to vote against the tabling motion.
$23, 8 nays.
Tabling motion prevailed. Back on Senate Bill 1701. Further discussion.